The first time Warren Bancroft saw Sadie Ramsey, she was riding hard along the eastern fence line of his property, her chestnut mare kicking up a wall of amber dust against a sky the color of hammered copper, and something in his chest cracked open like dry earth after the first rain of spring. He had not left the ranch in 4 months. That was the simple truth of it, and it was a truth that had settled over the Bancroft spread like a heavy blanket nobody wanted to discuss. 4 months since Warren had ridden the 2 miles of packed dirt road into the town of Coopersville, Texas. 4 months since he had bought supplies at Halbert's General Store, or shared a whiskey at the Dusty Spur Saloon, or even exchanged a word with a neighbor that was not conducted through a fence post or across a creek bed. 4 months since his brother Daniel had died of a fever that came on fast and cruel in the January cold, leaving Warren alone on 1,000 acres of cattle land with nothing but grief and routine to keep him anchored to the living world. It was May of 1882, and the Texas Hill Country had decided, regardless of Warren Bancroft's feelings on the matter, to be absolutely beautiful. He was mending the eastern fence when she rode past. He had been at it since before the sun was properly up, working the wire with rough gloves and a jaw set tight against the morning chill, and he had heard the hoofbeats before he saw her. He straightened, pulling off one glove and pressing the back of his hand against his forehead, where the sweat had started despite the cool air, and he turned expecting to see one of the Haverson boys cutting across from the north pasture as they sometimes did. It was not one of the Haverson boys. She was riding with the kind of purpose that only came from either knowing exactly where you were going or being desperately afraid of where you had come from. Her dark hair had mostly escaped whatever she had used to pin it and was streaming behind her like a flag. She wore a blue traveling dress that had seen better days, and her riding posture told Warren she had been in the saddle far longer than was comfortable. The chestnut mare beneath her was lathered but not panicked, which meant the woman controlling her was someone who knew horses, even in distress. She did not look his way. She was focused entirely on the road ahead of her, and she passed the fence line in perhaps 8 seconds, and then she was moving away from him toward the distant tree line where Coopersville Road bent west toward town. Warren stood holding his fence pliers and did not move for a full 10 seconds. Then he walked to the barn. He did not think about it the way a man thinks about a decision. He simply walked, as if his legs had made an agreement with some part of him that was wiser than his grieving mind. Inside the cool dark of the barn, he went straight to Copper, his buckskin gelding, and began saddling him with movements that were practiced and automatic. The smell of hay and horse and leather wrapped around him, and he breathed it in, and his hands buckled and cinched and tightened. And when he swung up onto Copper's back and rode out of the barn into the Texas morning, he felt the strangeness of it like a physical thing, the way a man feels his first breath after being held underwater. The ranch fell away behind him, and he did not look back at it. He rode at a steady canter along the fence line, following the direction the woman had taken, and the world he had been shut away from for 4 months began to reassemble itself around him with an almost overwhelming vividness. The smell of the bluebonnets that had sprung up along the roadside. The sound of a mockingbird doing its usual impersonation of every other bird in Texas. The distant lowing of cattle from some other man's land. The sky above him so wide and blue it made his chest hurt in an entirely different way than grief hurt. He spotted her about half a mile ahead, still moving at a canter, and he increased his own pace. She heard him coming before he drew alongside her, because she was clearly a woman accustomed to being aware of what was happening around her. She glanced back once, her dark eyes assessing him with quick intelligence, and she did not slow down. Warren slowed himself, bringing Copper into step just slightly behind and to the left of her mare, which was the polite distance, the non-threatening distance, and he raised his hat. "Morning, miss," he said. "That mare of yours is working hard." "She is," the woman said, and her voice was level but strained, and she kept her eyes forward. "She has been working hard since dawn. That's a fair stretch of riding, you heading into Coopersville. That is my general intention, yes." A pause. Is the road I am on the correct road? Coopersville is about 2 miles west, yes. You stay on this road and you will find it. She gave a short nod, and Warren could see now that there was something beyond exhaustion in the set of her shoulders. There was worry there, the particular kind of compressed worry that a person wore when they could not afford to show it completely. I am Warren Bancroft, he said. My ranch is back east along this road. The Bancroft spread. She glanced at him then, a fuller look, taking in his face and his manner with the unsentimental clarity of a woman who had learned to assess strangers quickly. Sadie Ramsey, she said. Warren nodded. Miss Ramsey, you are welcome to water your mare at the trough in front of Halbert's store when you get to town. They do not mind. Thank you, she said. They rode in silence for a moment, and Warren found he did not particularly want to fill it with noise. It was enough to be moving, to be outside the walls of the ranch he had been haunting like a ghost. And there was something about the quiet way this woman sat her horse, exhausted and worried and still somehow composed, that made the silence feel comfortable rather than awkward. Is there someone in Coopersville you are meeting? He asked, and then immediately felt the presumption of the question. Forgive me, that is none of my concern. No, it is all right. She let out a small breath. I am looking for work, Mr. Bancroft. I arrived in Texas 3 days ago by rail from Kansas City. I was told in Driscoll that Coopersville sometimes needed a school teacher. Warren looked at her. You are a teacher. I was a teacher, she said, with a weight on the past tense that told him there was a story attached to that distinction. I taught school in Missouri for 4 years, and then in Kansas City for 2. I am perfectly qualified. I do not doubt that, he said, and he meant it. There was a precision in the way she spoke that was unmistakable. Coopersville does have a schoolhouse. Whether they have a teacher position open is something you would need to take up with Elias Horn. He runs the town council, more or less. Is he a reasonable man? Warren considered this honestly. He is a practical man, which in some situations amounts to the same thing. Something that was almost a smile moved across her face before she suppressed it. That is a very diplomatic answer. I have had 4 months of practice at being diplomatic with myself. I am getting tolerably good at it. She looked at him again, and this time the look was more curious. You live alone on that ranch? I do now, he said simply. And then, because the morning was so beautiful and he had been alone so long, and there was something about this woman that made him want to speak the truth, he added, My brother died in January. We ran the spread together for 8 years. I have been managing since. I am sorry, she said, and the words were quiet and without any of the awkward excess that people usually attach to condolences. Just those 2 words, genuine and plain, and somehow that was more comforting than anything anyone had said to him in 4 months. Thank you, he said. They rode into Coopersville together, the 2-mile journey passing in a conversation that moved from school teaching to cattle ranching to the particular stubbornness of Texas weather. And Warren was aware of every word she said with a kind of heightened attention that he had not felt in a very long time. She was 24 years old, he would learn later. She was from a town called Millhaven in southern Missouri, where her father had been a school teacher himself, and she had learned the trade from watching him and had fallen in love with it genuinely, not just inherited it by circumstance. She had a mother who had died when she was 15 and a father who had died the previous autumn, and she had sold the house in Millhaven and taken the small amount of money, and decided that somewhere new was the only prescription for a grief that was becoming a closed room. Warren recognized that particular grief perfectly. Coopersville in May of 1882 was a town in the uncertain middle stage of its development. It had a main street of hard-packed dirt and a row of buildings that included Halbert's General Store, the Dusty Spur Saloon, a livery stable run by a man named Ortega who was quiet and extraordinarily competent, a small church with a bell that still worked, and a post office that doubled as the telegraph office. There was a schoolhouse on the north end of town, a low wooden building that had been built with ambition, and was currently being used to store grain sacks because the previous teacher, a Mr. Aldous Webb, had left for California 8 months ago without much notice. Elias Horn was a compact, weathered man in his mid-50s who wore the same canvas vest every day and had the perpetually narrowed eyes of someone accustomed to assessing risk. He was also, despite first impressions, fundamentally decent. Warren had known him for years, and when Warren walked into the general store with Sadie Ramsey at his side, Horn's eyebrows went up, because Warren Bancroft walking into anything in Coopersville was, at this point, a mild event worth noting. "Warren," Horn said, looking from Warren to the woman beside him with the careful neutrality of a man who had learned not to assume. "Good to see you out and about." "Elias," Warren said. "This is Miss Sadie Ramsey. She is a schoolteacher from Missouri, and she is looking for the position at your schoolhouse, if it is still available." Horn looked at Sadie with the kind of assessment he usually reserved for horses and property disputes. Sadie met his gaze directly and without fidgeting, and Warren could see Horn recalibrate slightly, the way practical men did when a situation exceeded their first low estimate. "You have credentials?" Horn asked. "I have letters of reference from the school board in Kansas City and the superintendent of Millhaven County Schools in Missouri," Sadie said, reaching into the bag she carried and producing a folded envelope with practiced efficiency. "I taught grammar, arithmetic, history, and basic natural science. I am comfortable with children from ages 6 to 16, and I believe in firm expectations and patient delivery." Horn took the letters. He read them more slowly than was strictly necessary, which Warren suspected was partly a power display and partly genuine surprise at their quality. "The schoolhouse needs some work," Horn said finally. "And we would need to clear out the McIntosh grain." "I can begin whenever the building is ready," Sadie said. "I am practical about conditions." Horn looked at Warren. "Where is she staying?" It was the question Warren had been turning over in his mind since about the midpoint of their 2-mile ride into town. Coopersville did not have a hotel. What it had was a boarding house run by a woman named Mrs. Clara Fentress, who was 60 years old and extremely particular about her residence. She had 2 rooms, and from what Warren last knew, both were occupied. "I had not gotten that far yet," Warren admitted. "Clara Fentress has her place full up," Horn confirmed. "Holt brothers are both boarding there through the summer while they work the McIntosh contract." Sadie's expression did not change, but Warren saw her swallow once. He saw the calculation happening behind her eyes, the assessment of her money against the cost of the options she did not currently have. "There is a linta behind the church," Horn said. "Pastor Nichols sometimes lets travelers use it. It is not much." "I will speak with Pastor Nichols," Sadie said calmly. Warren looked at her. He looked at the linta behind the church in his mind's eye, which he could construct from memory without any difficulty, including the gap in the north wall where the wood had warped and the floor that was more dirt than board. He thought about the 4 months he had spent alone in a house that had too many rooms in it. "Miss Ramsey," he said, "the Bancroft Ranch has a guest room that has not been used since Christmas. You would be welcome to use it while you are getting settled." Sadie looked at him with those direct dark eyes. "That is very kind of you, Mr. Bancroft, but I would not want to impose." "It is not an imposition," he said. "I have a housekeeper who comes Tuesdays and Fridays. Rosa Garza. She can chaperone any concerns about propriety, and the room is separate from the rest of the house." He paused. "The linta behind the church has a wall that lets in the weather from the north. We get cold nights still in May." Horn cleared his throat. "Warren's ranch is respectable enough. He is a known quantity in this town." Sadie looked from Horn to Warren and back again. There was a moment of weighing and measuring that Warren did not try to rush. He simply waited. "All right," she said finally, "until the schoolhouse position is settled and I can find permanent arrangements. Thank you, Mr. Bancroft." "Warren," he said before he could stop himself. She looked at him. A small pause. "Warren," she agreed. The drive back to the ranch was different from the ride into town, quieter and more settled, as if an agreement had been reached that extended beyond the practical arrangement of a guest room. Sadie rode her mare alongside Copper with an ease that came from genuine familiarity with horses, and in the better light of the mid-morning, Warren could see her more clearly now. She was perhaps 5 feet and 4 inches, with dark hair that she had pinned back up during her time at the general store, dark brown eyes set in a face that was arresting rather than conventionally pretty, a face with character in it, with the marks of thought and feeling, and a life lived with attention. She was not fragile and she was not performing toughness. She was simply herself, apparently, and that was something Warren found he could not easily look away from. He showed her the ranch with the self-consciousness of a man who had been living without any external view of his surroundings for some time. He saw it suddenly as someone else might see it, the main house with its wide porch and its 2 good rocking chairs, the barn that was well-maintained because Warren was meticulous about his animals even when he was not meticulous about himself, the kitchen garden that Rosa kept going because she refused to let it die, the smokehouse and the well and the corral where 3 of his horses stood watching the newcomers with mild equine interest. "It is a good spread," Sadie said, and she did not say it to be polite. She said it the way someone says a true thing. "Daniel built most of the outbuildings," Warren said. "He was the one with the building sense. I am better with the cattle." "How many head?" "About 340. I have 2 hands, Emmett Laru and his son Pete. They work the herd most days. I join them when I can." What he did not say was that for 4 months he had spent the hours between the required ranch work and sleep simply sitting on the porch or standing at the fence line, watching nothing in particular, moving through the days like a man underwater. He did not say it because there was no need to, and because something about this morning, about the spontaneous and entirely uncharacteristic act of saddling up and following a stranger down the road, had already begun to loosen something in him, like the first turn of a rusted bolt. Rosa Garza arrived the following Tuesday as she always did, and her reaction to finding Sadie Ramsey in the guest room was a complicated thing that moved through several stages in about 10 seconds. Rosa was 51 years old and had been housekeeper to the Bancroft family since Warren and Daniel were boys, and she had been watching Warren disappear into himself for 4 months with the helpless frustration of someone who loves a person they cannot reach. She looked at Sadie, and she looked at Warren, and she went into the kitchen and started making considerably more food than usual. Sadie was formally offered the schoolteacher position at the end of that first week, after Horn convened an emergency meeting of the town council that consisted of himself, the pastor, and Mrs. Fentress, who was technically not on the council but whose opinions functioned as policy. The grain sacks were cleared from the schoolhouse on a Saturday, and Warren drove the wagon and Emmett Laru's son Pete came along, and they worked through the morning without needing much discussion. And at some point, Sadie was up on a ladder cleaning the high windows and Warren stood below holding the ladder base and watching her work with an attentiveness he was not trying particularly hard to disguise. "You are going to strain your neck," she said without looking down. "I am making sure the ladder is steady," he said. "The ladder is perfectly steady, Warren." He looked away at the far wall and felt something that he recognized, with considerable surprise, as the mild, pleasant confusion of being thoroughly called out by someone he liked. The school opened on the second Monday of May with 11 children ranging from 6 to 15, and Sadie Ramsey stood in front of them with the calm authority of someone who had been born to exactly this. And Warren, who had driven her to the schoolhouse that morning and had absolutely no reason to linger, lingered for approximately 3 minutes watching through the window before Pete Laru found him and pointed out that the south pasture fence was not going to mend itself. The days fell into a rhythm. Sadie taught school in Coopersville during the week, and Warren rode in each morning to bring her the 2 miles to the schoolhouse and each evening to bring her back, because that was the logical thing to do given that she was staying at the ranch. And if he found himself spending slightly more time grooming Copper on mornings when she would ride beside him, that was simply good horsemanship. Rosa noticed. Emmett Laru noticed. Pete LaRue, who was 19 and considered himself a sophisticated observer of human nature, noticed and mentioned it to his father, who told him to mind his business, and then came and found Warren in the barn with the deliberate casualness of a man who was about to say something personal. "Good to see you about again," Emmett said, adjusting a harness that did not need adjusting. "I have been about," Warren said. "Getting into town regular, though, morning and evening." "That is a practical necessity given the current arrangements." Emmett nodded slowly. He was a large, quiet man from Louisiana who had come west 20 years ago and found that Texas suited him. He had been with the Bancroft spread for a decade, and he had liked Daniel Bancroft very much, and he had watched Warren with careful loyalty during the 4 months of the closed winter. "She seems like a fine woman," he said. "She is a fine teacher," Warren said. "The children are responding to her very well from what Horn says." "That too," Emmett said, and found something else to adjust and took his leave. There was an evening at the end of the second week when the wind came from the south, warm and carrying the smell of the approaching summer, and Sadie was sitting on the porch after supper with a book open in her lap but not being read, and Warren came out with 2 cups of coffee and handed one to her and sat in the other rocking chair, and they watched the stars appear above the hill country with the comfort of people who have known each other longer than 2 weeks. Or perhaps with the comfort of people who recognize each other in some way that has nothing to do with time. "Tell me about your brother," she said. It was the kind of question that could have landed badly, but she asked it in a way that was simply an invitation, not a demand, and not a delicate avoidance, but a genuine reaching out towards something she sensed he needed to put into words. He told her about Daniel. He told her how Daniel had been the talker and the builder, and the one who could argue a cattle price down to the last cent with a smile the whole time. He told her about how they had come to this land together with money saved from 5 years of working other men's cattle, and how they had built the house in pieces, a room at a time, and how Daniel had put the porch on last and had said it was the most important part because it was where you came to think. He told her about the fever that had come in a January ice storm and had moved fast and mean, and about sitting at Daniel's bedside and the particular helplessness of watching someone you love past all your ability to fix it. He had not told any of this to anyone. He had not had anyone to tell it to. Sadie listened without interrupting, and when he finished she said, "He sounds like the kind of person who makes a place feel possible." "That is exactly what he was," Warren said, and was surprised by the tightness in his throat. "My father was like that," she said. "After my mother died, he made our house feel like it could still be a home. I did not know how much of that was him until he was gone." The stars were very bright. A coyote called somewhere in the middle distance and was answered by another. "What made you leave Missouri?" he asked, though he thought he already understood. "The house was full of him," she said simply, "every corner of it." And grief in a place that is entirely saturated with the person you have lost is a different thing than grief in a new place. In Millhaven I was just sad. I thought if I went somewhere I had never been, I might eventually get to just be myself again instead of being the shape of what I was missing. Warren turned and looked at her profile in the lamplight from the window. She was not looking at him. She was looking at the stars. "Is it working?" he asked. A pause. "I think it might be," she said. The third week brought complications that were less internal and more practical, as complications in the Texas Hill Country in 1882 tended to do. A man named Caleb Rudd arrived in Coopersville with 2 men who worked for him, and announced to Elias Horn that he was interested in purchasing the land south of the Bancroft spread, which was currently owned by a widow named Mrs. Adelaide Prout, who was in her 70s and had been trying to sell for 2 years. On the surface, this was straightforward enough. Beneath the surface it was not, because Caleb Rudd's interest in the land was connected to the creek that ran through it, which was also one of the water sources for the Bancroft cattle in the summer months. Warren heard about it on a Wednesday morning when he rode into Coopersville to collect Sadie at noon, as she dismissed her class for a midday break. He heard it from Halbert himself, who was a reliable source of information if not always of interpretation. Rudd has been buying up water access south of here for 3 years, Warren said, when he told Sadie on the drive back that evening. He runs a large operation over toward Medina County. If he controls that creek, it does not mean he can cut off my access legally, but it means I will be dealing with a neighbor who has reason to want me to move. Can he do that? Sadie asked. She had learned quickly about the particular texture of land and water disputes in this part of Texas. He can make things uncomfortable. That creek is supplemental to my main well, but in a dry summer it matters, and we are heading into what feels like it could be a dry summer. He was quiet for a moment. Mrs. Prout has every right to sell to whoever she pleases. I'm not saying otherwise. I just need to think about what this means for the spread. Have you spoken with Mrs. Prout? He had not. He had not, in fact, spoken with Mrs. Prout in 4 months for the same reason he had not spoken with anyone. But that, he recognized, was no longer a reason. He went to see Adelaide Prout the following afternoon, a woman with iron-gray hair and the kind of dignity that came from 50 years of surviving on Texas land without complaint. She received him in her parlor with a pitcher of lemonade and the direct gaze of someone who knows her own business. "Warren Bancroft," she said, "I heard you were moving about again." "I am trying," he said honestly. "Your brother was a good man. I told you that at the funeral, and I am telling you again." She poured the lemonade. "You want to talk about the Rudd offer?" "I do, if you do not mind." "His offer is fair," she said. "I will tell you that plainly. He is not cheating me. But I have not signed anything yet because something about the man sits sideways with me, and I cannot tell you exactly why." She studied Warren. "I have known your family for a long time. Is there something I should know about Caleb Rudd?" "He is not known to me personally," Warren said carefully. "But men who make a business of buying water access tend to be interested in leverage. Whether that is your concern or mine, I cannot say." Adelaide Prout was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What would it mean for your cattle if he controlled the South Creek?" "In a wet year, not much. In a dry year, potentially a fair amount." She nodded slowly. "I want this land sold, Warren. I am too old to work it, and my children are in San Antonio and have no interest in coming back. But I would rather it went to someone who was going to ranch it than someone who is going to use it as a chess piece." "That is a reasonable preference," he said. What came next was not something he had planned. He had come to gather information, not to make an offer. But sitting in Adelaide Prout's parlor with her direct gaze on him and the picture of the South Creek land in his mind, he heard himself say, "I could buy it." He rode home with his mind working through the numbers in a way it had not worked through anything for months, and when he reached the ranch yard, Sadie was already home from the schoolhouse, having gotten a ride with Pastor Nichols, and she was in the kitchen garden with Rosa pulling weeds in the late afternoon light. "You look like a man who has made a decision," Rosa said. "I think I might have," Warren said. Sadie stood up, pressing the small of her back. There was a smudge of dirt on her left cheek. Warren found this detail excessively distracting and looked at the garden instead. "About the Rudd situation?" she asked. "I am thinking about buying the Prout land," he said. "It would extend the spread south and keep the creek access. The numbers are difficult but not impossible if I sell a portion of the eastern pasture that I have been running light anyway." Sadie tilted her head. "Is it the right choice for the ranch or the right choice to keep Rudd out?" "It is the right choice for the ranch," he said. "I have been meaning to expand south for years. Daniel and I talked about it. The timing is just being pushed by circumstances." Rosa looked between them with the mild satisfaction of someone watching something they have been hoping for move in the right direction. The purchase of the Prout land took 3 weeks to finalize, involving a solicitor from the county seat and a fair amount of paperwork and one visit from Caleb Rudd himself, who arrived at the Bancroft ranch on a Tuesday morning with a pleasant manner that did not quite reach his eyes. He was a large man in his 50s with the kind of smile that had been deployed in many negotiations. "I understand you have made an offer to Mrs. Prout," he said, accepting a cup of coffee in the kitchen. "I have," Warren said. You know I had an offer there first. She told me your offer was fair and that she had not signed, Warren said, so there was still an open field. Rudd studied him. You are taking on a fair stretch of debt to do this. My finances are my concern. Of course. Rudd drank his coffee. He glanced around the kitchen, taking in the room with the assessing gaze of someone who is always measuring, and his eyes briefly found Sadie's school bag hanging by the door, a detail that clearly registered. Word in town is you have a schoolteacher staying here. Miss Ramsey is our new school teacher and she is a guest on the property, Warren said. Coopersville has been glad to have her. I am sure, Rudd said, in a tone that was carefully without any specific implication but managed to carry several. Warren felt the slow rise of something in his chest that was not anger exactly but was adjacent to it. He kept his voice level. Is there something I can help you with today, Mr. Rudd? Rudd set down his coffee cup. I am going to be a neighbor whether the Prout land deal closes your way or mine, he said. I have a large operation and I deal straight. I thought it was worth introducing myself. It was, Warren said. After Rudd left, Warren stood in the kitchen for a moment. Sadie came in from the porch where she had been sitting and he suspected she had heard most of the conversation. He was not threatening, she observed. No, Warren agreed. He was establishing. Men like that like people to know their size before anything actually happens. Will it become a problem? Not if the Prout sale closes, he said. After that, he would have to go considerably further north to find another land angle, and it would not be worth his while. She was standing across the kitchen table from him, and the afternoon light was coming through the window behind her, and Warren was aware suddenly, with an almost physical force, of how much he had come to depend on her presence in this house. Not as a house guest and not as a practical companion for conversation, but as a person whose presence made the rooms feel inhabited rather than just occupied. He had been inhabiting this house for 4 months without actually being present in it, and somewhere in the last 3 weeks that had changed. He thought he should probably say something about that, and he did not say anything about it, and she went back to the porch and he went to find Emmett about the afternoon feeding. The thing that changed between them happened on a Saturday evening in early June when they rode out together to the south fence to look at the Prout land that was in the process of becoming Bancroft land. The paperwork was nearly done. Warren wanted to ride the boundary and think, and he had asked Sadie if she wanted to come, and she had said yes with the particular directness she used for things she actually wanted, which was different from her polite acceptances of things she would do but did not particularly need. They rode the fence line as the sun went down behind the cedar hills, and the light turned everything gold and the shadows stretched long across the grass, and the creek that ran through the south corner caught the light and held it for a moment like a thread of copper. The land was good. Warren could see it clearly, what it could be, how the cattle would use it in the dry summer months. This is going to be beautiful, Sadie said, looking across the creek. It already is, Warren said, and he was not looking at the creek. She turned and looked at him, and there was a moment that was perfectly suspended, the way moments are when they are about to become something permanent. Warren, she said, and stopped. I know, he said. I know I am not saying it in any clear way. I am not, historically, someone who says things in a clear way. Daniel used to say I could miss the point of a conversation like nobody he had ever met. He stopped, started again. I think about you when I am not with you. I think about what you would say about things. I have been doing that since about day 3 of your being here, and I think it is time I said so. She was quiet for long enough that he began to wonder if he had miscalculated, and then she said, I came to Coopersville to find work and a new start. I was not expecting any of this. I know, he said. I was not expecting it either. I had not left the ranch in 4 months. I was not expecting to find a reason to saddle up. The corner of her mouth curved. Was I the reason you saddled up? You were, he said simply. She looked back at the creek. The gold was fading to rose now and the first stars were appearing. I am not a person who falls into things easily, she said. I think carefully. I have had enough loss to know that feelings are not enough on their own. They need to be built on something. That seems right to me, he said. But I also think, she said more slowly, that I have been paying attention to you for 3 weeks, and what I see is someone I would want to know for a long time. He looked at her profile against the fading sky. That is the most honest thing anyone has said to me in a long time, he said. I told you I was practical, she said. And finally she turned and looked at him directly, and there was a warmth in her eyes that she was not trying to moderate. He did not kiss her that evening, because it was not the right moment for that yet, but something had been named between them that could not be unnamed, and on the ride back to the ranch in the dark, they rode close enough that their knees occasionally touched, and neither of them moved away. June deepened into a summer that turned out to be, as Warren had suspected, on the dry side. The creek on the new Prout land proved its worth by the end of the first month, and Warren extended the south pasture fence and moved the largest portion of his herd onto the grass that the creek kept green. Emmett Laru worked alongside him through the long hot days, and Pete handled the horses and the routine feeding, and the Bancroft spread moved into the season with a steadiness it had not had since January. Sadie taught school through June and into July, when the summer session ended by common agreement since the children were needed for farm work. During those weeks, the morning rides to Coopersville became one of the things Warren looked forward to most in his day, which was something he was self-aware enough to recognize as significant. They talked about everything. They argued amicably about the best method for handling a mending fence, and about whether Milton's Paradise Lost was worth the effort, and about the proper role of the federal government in the territories. And Warren discovered that Sadie had opinions on a wide range of subjects, and was not in the habit of softening them for politeness, which he found consistently and thoroughly refreshing. He told her things he had not told anyone. About the years before he and Daniel came to Texas, when they had been working cattle in Kansas and Colorado, and saving money with a focused determination that their parents had called stubbornness and they had called planning. About the time he had broken his left arm falling from a horse at 17 and had not told anyone because he needed the paycheck. About the dream he had at least once a month where Daniel was still alive and they were arguing about something ridiculous, and when he woke up the silence of the house had a particular weight to it. She told him about teaching in Missouri, about the parents who had doubted a young woman could manage a classroom, and about proving them wrong not through confrontation but through results. About Kansas City, which she had loved for its energy and left for its anonymity. About her father, who had believed that education was the most revolutionary act a person could undertake in a world that spent a great deal of energy trying to keep people from thinking clearly. One morning in mid-June, she told him about why she had left Kansas City specifically. She had been engaged, she said, to a man named Thomas Alcott who had been a lawyer and had been charming and had, it turned out, been conducting a separate relationship with a woman in St. Louis for the better part of their engagement. She had discovered this through a letter misdirected to her address, which she described as the universe's clumsy but effective intervention. I was not so much heartbroken as I was angry, she said, and then I was embarrassed, and then I thought about staying in Kansas City and seeing him at every social occasion, and decided that was a form of punishment I had not signed up for. He was a fool, Warren said, with a flatness that was more sincere than any elaborate statement. She looked at him sideways from under the brim of her hat. You say that with considerable feeling for someone who has never met him. I say it with feeling because I am in a position to appreciate what he failed to appreciate, Warren said, and then felt the blood come up in his face slightly, which was not something that happened to him as a rule. Sadie looked at the road ahead. Her mare's ears were pricked forward in the warm morning. That is possibly the nicest thing you have said to me, she said. I am working up to nicer things, he said. She laughed, a real laugh, the kind that was not performed for anyone's benefit, and it was one of the finest sounds Warren had heard in a long time. He kissed her for the first time on the evening of the 4th of July, when Coopersville held its annual Independence Day celebration with a bonfire and a fiddle player, and a considerable amount of pie contributed by the women of the town. They were standing at the edge of the firelight near the horse pen, while the fiddle played something lively inside, and children ran past screaming with sparklers, and Sadie had a small smudge of blackberry pie at the corner of her mouth, and Warren, without thinking at all, reached out and touched the corner of her mouth with his thumb to wipe it away, and she went very still, and he did not move his hand, and then she looked up at him, and he kissed her. It was not a complicated kiss. It was very straightforward, actually. His hand against her jaw and her tilting up toward him, and both of them knowing exactly what it meant and being glad of it. When they stepped back from each other, the fiddle was playing something slower, and the bonfire was sending sparks up into the summer dark, and Rosa Garza, who had somehow materialized 15 feet away with a plate of pie and no particular reason to be standing exactly there, turned around and walked in a different direction with great dignity. "I have been wanting to do that for some time," Warren said. "I have been aware of that," Sadie said, and there was a light in her eyes that had nothing to do with the bonfire and everything to do with the fact that she had been wanting it too. July passed in the particular amber glow that a Texas summer has when it is hot and clear, and the work is hard, and the evenings are long. The school was on break, and Sadie spent her mornings helping Rosa with the kitchen garden and her afternoons writing lesson plans for the fall session with the rigor and organization of someone who genuinely loved the work. And sometimes she rode out with Warren to check the south pasture, and sometimes he came and sat on the porch with her in the evening, and they talked or did not talk, both being equally comfortable, which was its own kind of luxury. He loved her. He did not say so yet because he was a man who needed to be certain before he said things of that weight, and he was building toward certain the way he had built the spread, one solid thing at a time. But he was clear in himself, had been clear since somewhere in June, and the clarity of it was something he carried around like a stone in his pocket, something real and specific and entirely his. The complication that summer was not Caleb Rudd, who, with the closing of the Prout land sale, had indeed moved his attentions elsewhere and acknowledged Warren's presence in the South Territory with the grudging respect of a practical man. The complication was a dry stretch in late July that affected the creek level and required Warren to move the cattle rotation twice in 2 weeks, which put him in the saddle for longer hours and meant less time in the evenings. He came home tired in ways that went into the bone, and on more than one of those evenings, he found supper kept warm on the stove and Sadie sitting on the porch with a lamp, and the simple domesticity of that was almost more than he knew how to hold without it undoing him. One evening she met him at the barn while he was unsaddling Copper, and she helped without being asked, which was the thing about her that he found consistently moving, the way she simply did what was needed without fanfare or performance. "You need sleep," she said. "I need more water in that creek," he said. "Both," she said firmly. "But the creek is going to do what it does, and you are going to wear yourself down if you keep going at this pace. The cattle need moving. I know that, and you have Emmett. Let Emmett make more decisions and you make fewer for the next week." He looked at her across Copper's back. "Are you telling me how to run my ranch?" "Yes," she said simply. "Is that a problem?" He thought about it. "No," he said, with the honesty that she always seemed to produce in him without effort. "Actually, no. I think I needed someone to say it." She reached up and scratched Copper's ear, which the horse appreciated extravagantly. "You run this ranch like you are trying to carry it rather than run it," she said. "Maybe since January, you do not have to do every single thing yourself." "It was easier when there were 2 of us," he said, and it came out quieter than he intended. She came around the horse and stood in front of him. She put her hand against his chest, a simple gesture, and looked up at him with the kind of steadiness that was better than any comfort built from words. "I know," she said. He put his hand over hers, and they stood there in the quiet barn with the horses moving softly around them and the last of the summer light coming through the high window in long gold bars. "Sadie," he said, "I know," she said again, and she did. He kissed her forehead and she leaned into him for a moment, and it was the most ordinary and the most significant thing he had done in years. The fall came with rain, finally and gratuitously, the sky opening up in September with the kind of sustained downpour that Texas sometimes produces as a correction for its own excessive drought. The creek rose satisfyingly. The grass recovered. Warren watched the south pasture from the fence line one afternoon with Emmett beside him and felt the particular rancher's relief of watching land come back to life. "Good piece of land you picked up," Emmett said. "It is," Warren agreed. "Adelaide Prout would be pleased to see how it is being used. She is still in town, Emmett. She can come look whenever she pleases." Emmett smiled slowly. "You are in a much better frame of mind than you were in February. February was a difficult month." "January, February, March, April," Emmett said mildly, which was his version of making a point. Warren looked at him. "I know," he said. "I am grateful for your patience." Emmett waved this off. "You had your reasons, good reasons." He paused. "Miss Ramsey is going to stay on, do you think, after the winter?" It was the question Warren had been turning in his mind. Sadie had lodging at the ranch, and her school position was going well into the fall session, and things between them had developed with a warmth and a depth that was not merely circumstantial. But they had not spoken of the future in explicit terms, and Warren was aware that there was a conversation that needed to happen. He had it 2 weeks later, on a Sunday afternoon when the rain had stopped, and the air smelled of wet cedar and the hills were incredibly green. They were walking along the creek on the south section, Sadie with her boots getting damp in the grass and apparently not minding, and Warren had been working toward what he wanted to say for about 20 minutes. "I need to ask you something," he said. She looked up at him. "I love you," he said, starting there rather than with the question because it seemed important to establish the foundation before the structure. "I want to be clear about that. I love you, and I have for some months now, and it is not a sudden thing or a temporary thing. It is the kind of thing I would like to build on." She had stopped walking. She was looking at him with an expression that was open and serious and beautiful. "I am going to ask if you will marry me," he said, "but I want to ask it as a real question and not a statement with a question mark at the end. I want you to have room to say what you actually think. Because I want you to stay here, and I want you to have this land and this house and the school in Coopersville, and I want to argue with you about Milton and have you tell me when I am overdoing things, and I want all of that for as long as we have." He paused. "But your life before you rode past this ranch was a whole life, and you have your own sense of what you want, and so it is a real question. Will you marry me?" Sadie stood in the wet grass by the creek on the south section of the Bancroft spread, and the sun was coming through the cedar trees in long fractured rays, and she looked at him for a long moment with everything he felt reflected back at him in her dark eyes. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Warren, I will marry you." He stepped forward and pulled her in and held her, and she pressed her face into his shoulder, and he felt her laugh quietly against him, a sound of pure gladness. "You were worried," she said. "Somewhat," he admitted. "I have been in love with you since June," she said. "I was waiting for you to get there yourself." "I was there in June," he said with considerable dignity. "I was simply being thorough." She pulled back and looked at him, and the laughter in her face was the best thing he had ever seen. "You are an incredibly careful man, Warren Bancroft. I prefer the word thorough." "I know you do," she said, and kissed him. With the creek running beside them and the cedar hills going green in every direction and Texas doing its best impression of paradise. The wedding was in November, in the Coopersville church with Pastor Nichols officiating, and the entire town in attendance because Coopersville was small enough that the entire town fit in the church, and because both Warren Bancroft and Sadie Ramsey had, in different ways, become essential to its daily life. Warren in the way of a man whose ranch is one of the economic anchors of the surrounding land, and Sadie in the way of someone whose teaching had already, in 6 months, visibly changed the quality of attention and ambition in 11 children. Rosa Garza cried from the moment the ceremony started to the moment it ended, and for approximately 40 minutes afterward. Emmett Laru stood at the back of the church with his hat in his hands, and his face composed in the careful blankness of a man who was moved and not willing to demonstrate it publicly. Pete Laru, who had developed a terrible and obvious crush on Sadie during the summer, attended with the philosophical resignation of the young, and subsequently ate an astonishing amount of the reception pie. Elias Horn made a speech that was factual and warm in the particular combination that characterized him, noting that Coopersville had gained 2 good people in the same year, and that the Bancroft spread was going to be a better place for having someone in it who would tell Warren when he was wrong. Sadie wore a cream-colored dress that she and Rosa had made together over the preceding 3 weeks, and her dark hair was up with small wildflowers threaded through it. And when she came down the aisle toward Warren, she was looking directly at him with that directness he had loved since the first moment. She turned it on him from the back of her tired chestnut mare on the road into Coopersville, and he thought he would never in his life feel anything more clearly than what he felt in that moment. They spoke their vows with the simple gravity of people who did not need to make them elaborate because they were going to keep them. And when Pastor Nichols said they were married and Warren kissed his wife for the first time as her husband, the church made the sort of communal sound that small towns make when something goes right after a period of things going wrong. The winter of 1882 into 1883 was a real winter, not cruel the way the previous one had been, but genuinely cold, with frost on the windows some mornings and ice in the water troughs that had to be broken each day. Warren and Sadie settled into the ranch together with a naturalness that surprised him, though perhaps it should not have, given that they had been operating like partners for months already. She continued teaching through the winter session. He managed the ranch through the hard weather with the additional energy of a man who had something to come home to that was not just a silent house. There were adjustments. She was a woman who kept later hours than he did, reading by lamplight when he had been asleep for an hour. He was a man who was up before sunrise and could be briefly incomprehensible before his first cup of coffee, which she found funny rather than irritating, which was, he thought, a significant indicator of compatibility. She had opinions about the kitchen that occasionally conflicted with Rosa's, and those two negotiated a careful diplomatic arrangement with each other that eventually settled into genuine affection. He had a habit of leaving his work gloves on the kitchen table that she mentioned 3 times before he stopped doing it. But beneath those small frictions was something steady and warm that he had not known to expect, the particular pleasure of knowing another person and being known by them, of having someone in the house who understood the reference and caught the meaning, and was there at the end of the day in a way that was both ordinary and consistently extraordinary. That spring, Sadie told him she was expecting their first child. She told him on a March morning with the bluebonnets just starting along the fence line, and he stood in the kitchen and felt something move through him that was larger than anything he had words for, a kind of hope that was also a kind of fear and also something that was purely and entirely joy. When, he said, "October, I think," she said, "maybe September." He crossed the kitchen and took her face in his hands and looked at her for a long moment. "Are you well?" He asked because that was the most important thing. "I am very well," she said with her characteristic directness. "A little tired in the mornings, but very well." He kissed her forehead. He kissed her mouth. He held her in the middle of the kitchen in the March morning light. "Daniel would have been so happy," he said against her hair. "I know," she said. "I think about that." He sent Emmett Laru into Coopersville that morning with a note for Rosa, because Rosa needed to know and he trusted her to handle the town's reactions with appropriate discretion, which she did, which meant that by noon most of Coopersville knew, and by evening there had been 2 pies and a jar of preserves left at the ranch gate. The spring session of the school went on with Sadie teaching through May, and then she made the reasonable decision to let the summer break be an actual rest rather than planning an extended session. Warren caught her in the kitchen garden one evening in June, sitting on the low stool she had moved out there, looking across the south pasture in the late light with one hand resting on the visible round of her belly and he stopped in the yard and watched her for a moment and felt the deep animal satisfaction of a life that was becoming what it was supposed to be. "You are staring," she said without turning around. "I am allowed," he said. "You are my wife." "Sit with me," she said, and he came and pulled the other low stool over and sat beside her in the kitchen garden in the June evening, and the cattle were moving in the south pasture, and the mockingbird was at it again in the cedar tree by the barn, and they sat together in the easy silence of two people who have found their place. The summer brought new complications of the routine cattle ranching kind. A fence dispute with a neighbor to the north named Caldwell that required careful conversation, a section of the barn roof that needed replacing after a June storm, and a minor outbreak of illness among the younger cattle that Emmett managed with the competence of a man who had seen it before. Warren worked through all of it with the focused energy of someone who had something clear to work toward, which was different from the 4 months of mechanical survival that had preceded Sadie's appearance on the road. He thought sometimes about that morning. The fence pliers in his hand and the hoofbeats on the road and the 8 seconds of watching her ride past. The absolute uncalculating impulse that had taken him from the fence post to the barn to Copper's back to the road. He had not thought about it. He had simply moved, and in moving had moved toward everything. In September, a boy was born at the Bancroft Ranch, delivered by the town's physician, Dr. Marcus Wills, who made the ranch call on a Tuesday morning after a labor that was long but, by the doctor's assurance and Sadie's own insistence on being told the truth, normal and without serious complication. Warren spent most of the labor in the kitchen being managed by Rosa, who fed him coffee and did not let him pace more than absolutely necessary, and when Dr. Wills came out and said that mother and son were both doing well, Warren sat down on the kitchen bench and put his face in his hands for a moment, and Rosa patted him on the back and said nothing at all, which was the right response. He went in to see Sadie. She was propped against the pillows with a baby in her arms, and her face had the particular look of someone who had just done something genuinely enormous, and was still in the first minutes of understanding it. The baby was red-faced and apparently indignant about the entire situation and was making it known. "Hello," Warren said from the doorway, because he could not immediately think of anything else. Sadie looked up and her face opened into something that was not quite a smile but was larger than a smile. "Come here," she said. He crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son. "He looks angry," Warren said. "He is new," Sadie said. "He has reason to be." "He is perfect," Warren said, which was what he meant. "Yes," Sadie agreed, and the love in her voice was so plain and so enormous that it settled around them both like something solid. They named him Daniel James Bancroft. Daniel for the brother who had made the land possible and James for Sadie's father, who had made her who she was. The name had 2 good histories behind it, and Warren thought it was the right way to carry both forward. The fall returned Sadie to the schoolhouse, though not until Daniel was 2 months old and sturdy, and well established in the habits of a baby who knew exactly what he wanted and communicated those wants with considerable volume. Rosa Garza rearranged her schedule and came 5 days a week instead of 2, and she handled Daniel with the authority and expertise of a woman who had raised children and grandchildren, and knew that babies, like cattle and weather, required consistency. Sadie came back to the schoolhouse in November to a new group that had grown to 14 children, including 3 who had come with a family that had settled north of town over the summer. The town council had formally doubled her salary, which Elias Horn delivered with the expressionless dignity of someone doing the correct thing, while not being certain exactly how the budget would absorb it. Sadie accepted with the directness she applied to everything. The winter of 1883 was mild, mercifully, and the ranch moved through it with the particular settled confidence of a spread that has figured itself out. Warren expanded the cattle operation again in the spring, buying another 80 head at the county auction and running them on the south section, and Emmett Larue's son Pete proved himself ready for more responsibility and was given it. and the Bancroft spread began to look less like a ranch in recovery and more like what it had always had the potential to be. Warren rode the fence lines in the spring mornings, as he had always done, but the mornings felt different now. The ranch was full in ways it had not been for years. Sadie's lesson plans were stacked on the desk in what had been Daniel's room, now the study. Baby Daniel, who was 8 months old by spring, and had decided that the world was far more interesting than anyone had prepared him for, had taken to pulling himself upright against the porch railing and studying the yard with the focused intensity of a future rancher. Rosa observed this and said, "That one is going to be trouble in the best way." "He gets that from his mother," Warren said. Sadie, overhearing this from inside, said, "He gets the trouble from his father and the focus from me." "That is an entirely unverifiable claim," Warren said. "Go look at my student records and tell me I am not organized," she said. He went and looked at her student records, which were impeccable, and he came back and said nothing, and she smiled at him over baby Daniel's head with the bright satisfaction of someone who is consistently right and knows it. The second spring, Sadie told him she thought they might have another child by Christmas. This was received with equal joy, and with Warren's immediate suggestion that they talk to Dr. Wills at the earliest opportunity, which Sadie agreed to while noting that she was in excellent health, and he should stop hovering before he had even started. He nodded seriously and then hovered anyway, and she let him because she understood that it was how he expressed the love he was not always able to put into words. She told him once, in bed in the early morning with the Texas dawn coming pink through the window, that she thought about the first morning sometimes. The morning she had ridden past his fence line. "I was so tired," she said. "I had been on that road since before sunrise. I just remember thinking, keep moving, and not thinking about anything beyond the next mile." "Did you see me?" he asked. "I did," she said. "I saw a man mending a fence. I thought you looked self-contained." "Self-contained," he repeated. "Is that unflattering?" "No," he said honestly. "It is probably accurate. You did not look like someone who would follow a stranger down the road," she said. "I was not someone who would follow a stranger down the road," he said. "Up until the moment I did." She turned and looked at him in the early light. "What made you?" He had thought about this. He had thought about it from many angles, the way you think about the things that turn out to matter most. "I do not know that I can give you a satisfying answer," he said. "You rode past and something in me just moved. I had been still for a very long time." "For months," she said. "For months," he agreed. "And then you rode past and I saddled up." She reached out and put her hand against his face, which she did sometimes when she wanted to say something and touch him at the same time. "I am glad you did," she said. "So am I," he said. "Every single day." The Christmas child turned out to be twins, which Dr. Wills diagnosed in October with a slight widening of the eyes and the professional composure of a man who had seen most things. Sadie took this information with a stillness that lasted approximately 45 seconds and then transformed into the practical planning mode that was her natural response to large events. Warren sat down. "Twins," he said. "That appears to be what he is telling us," Sadie said. "Two," Warren said. "That is typically what twins means, yes." He looked at her. "Are you all right?" "I am going to need a larger crib," she said, which was her version of yes. Rosa, upon hearing the news, made a sound of pure satisfaction and immediately began knitting twice as fast. The twins were born in late December of 1884, a boy and a girl, arriving in the particular dramatic fashion of people who would spend their lives trying to outdo each other. The boy came first and was named William, and the girl came 18 minutes later and was named Clara, after Mrs. Fentress, who had been unexpectedly kind during Sadie's first weeks in Coopersville, and who cried when she heard about the naming with a sincerity that nobody mentioned in order to preserve her dignity. The Bancroft Ranch on a morning in early January of 1885 was a house of considerable noise and purpose. Baby Daniel, now 16 months old and operating largely upright and at speed, investigated everything within reach. William and Clara were small and furious and perpetually hungry, and Rosa had moved in for the month with the authority of someone who knows what needs doing. Warren moved through the days with the particular luminous exhaustion of a man who is happier than he has ever been, and is also sleeping less than he has ever slept. He found Sadie one evening sitting in the rocking chair on the porch, nursing Clara, with William asleep in the cradle beside her and Daniel making determined progress across the porch boards toward anything he had not been allowed to touch. The night was cold and clear and full of stars. "You should be inside," he said. "I needed a minute of sky," she said. He understood this completely. He pulled up the other rocking chair and sat beside her. "Are you happy?" He asked because he always wanted to know, because he never wanted to assume. She looked at him in the starlight. "Warren Bancroft," she said, with the warmth that she put in his name when she was feeling it most. "I'm happier than I believed it was possible to be when I was riding that road in the dark." He reached over and took her free hand and held it. "I want to tell you something," she said. "Tell me." "That morning, the morning you rode after me," she looked at the stars. "I heard the hoofbeats. I thought it was someone following me with bad intentions, and I calculated whether my mare had enough left in her to outrun whoever it was." A pause. "And then you pulled alongside me with your hat raised and your voice perfectly calm, and I knew within about 30 seconds that you were not a threat." 30 seconds is a rapid assessment," he said. "I told you I think carefully," she said. "I just think quickly," he smiled. "And after 30 seconds, I thought you seemed like a man who meant what he said." She looked at him. "I was right." He brought her hand up and pressed his mouth against her fingers and held it there. "I would do it again," he said. "Every morning of that 4 months if I had known you were about to ride past. I would have found that extremely alarming," she said. "Noted," he said, and she laughed, the quiet laugh that was entirely for him, and the stars were brilliant above the hill country, and the ranch spread out around them in the dark, good land, working land that had been grief and was now something else entirely. Clara made a small sound and Sadie adjusted her, and Warren watched his wife with his daughter in the cold January night and felt the fullness of it all the way into the bone. Not the hollow ache that had lived there for 4 months after Daniel died, but something that was the true opposite of that ache. Something that had been building since a morning in May of 1882 when he had stood at a fence post and heard hoofbeats and looked up. Spring came again, as it always did in Texas, with the bluebonnets and the mockingbirds and the smell of the cedar warming up, and the cattle moving restless in the south pasture. Daniel, 2 years old now and talking with opinions, went everywhere Warren went that spring, held in the crook of his father's arm on Copper's back or toddling behind him in the barn, with a focused intentionality that made Emmett LaRue laugh. Warren taught him the names of the horses and the proper way to stand near them, and the sound the creek made in different seasons. Sadie's school grew to 20 students by the fall of that year. She wrote a proposal to the town council for a second classroom, which she presented to Elias Horn with the same organized directness she brought to everything. And Horn looked at the proposal and looked at Sadie and said, "When do you want to start building?" Which was his highest form of approval. The Bancroft Ranch and the Coopersville School became, in the years that followed, 2 of the most dependable institutions in that part of the hill country. Warren built the spread to 500 head and bought the eastern pasture from a man who was moving north to Kansas, and Emmett LaRue's son Pete eventually bought a small plot of land adjacent and ran his own modest herd with Warren's advice and without Warren's interference, which was the distinction that made the advice acceptable. Rosa Garza worked with the Bancroft family until her knees made the daily rides from town impractical, at which point she moved into the small room at the back of the ranch house that Warren built with his own hands in 3 weekends in the autumn, and she managed the household with the same authority and more comfort than she had ever managed it before. Mrs. Adelaide Prout came to see how the south section was being used, as Warren had said she was welcome to, and she stood at the fence looking at the creek and the cattle and the green grass and said, "I am satisfied," in a tone that encompassed everything she might have said more. Caleb Rudd, having found his water ambitions effectively blocked in this part of the territory, moved his operations further west and was not much of a factor in anyone's Coopersville story after 1883. The children grew. Daniel became a boy who was exactly what Rosa had predicted, trouble in the best way, which translated as curiosity that operated faster than permission. He loved the horses and the land and his parents with an uncomplicated ferocity, and Warren taught him to ride on Copper's back in the summer of his 4th year, and Sadie watched from the fence with Clara on her hip and William pulling at her skirt trying to see, and said nothing about the height at all, which Warren recognized as an act of love. William was quieter and more precise than his twin, a boy who liked to take things apart and understand them, and who at 5 years old presented Warren with a proposal for a better water distribution system from the South Creek to the North Pasture that was, upon examination, basically sound. Sadie taught him to read with the same patience and attention she gave to her school students, which she gave because she loved it, and because she had never been capable of giving less than her full attention to something that mattered. Clara was fearless, which Warren and Sadie discussed with the alarmed pride of parents who know exactly where fearlessness comes from and cannot in good conscience complain about it. She was also, by all evidence, going to be a teacher. She sat her dolls in rows and instructed them with an authority that already bore a strong resemblance to her mother's classroom presence. And when she told Sadie at age 4 that she wanted to teach school when she grew up, Sadie said yes, if that is what you want, and that is exactly what you should do. On an evening in the spring when the twins were 4 and Daniel was 5.5 and the ranch was running well, and the school was full, and the bluebonnets were up along every fence line for miles, Warren and Sadie sat on the porch as they had sat on hundreds of evenings since the first one, with the hill country spread out around them and the stars coming up and the sound of the children inside with Rosa and the quiet particular to the end of a good day. "I want to tell you something," Warren said. She turned and looked at him. "I know I am not the most forthcoming man in terms of saying things directly," he said. "You have improved significantly over the years," she said, with a smile. "I have had good encouragement," he said. He looked out at the land. "I was thinking today about who I was when you rode past that fence. I was not well, Sadie. I was going through the motions of living. I had been doing it for 4 months, and I might have done it a good deal longer. I honestly do not know." He turned and looked at her. "You changed that, not by being a solution to a problem, but by being a person who made me want to be present again. And everything that is good in the last 4 years comes from the morning I saddled up." She was quiet for a moment, and her eyes were bright in the porch light. "You were the one who saddled up," she said softly. "I want to be clear about that. I did not make you do anything. You chose to move." "I did," he said, "but I needed a reason." She reached over and took his hand. "We were each other's reason," she said. "I was running toward something without knowing what it was, and you were standing still for the same reason, and the road happened to put us in the same place at the same time. And I saddled up," he said. "And you saddled up," she agreed. He lifted her hand to his mouth and kissed it the way he had kissed it on the porch in January, with the twins newborn and the stars blazing. She leaned in and put her head on his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they sat in the spring evening with the land they had built their life on going green in every direction. Inside, Daniel made a sound of dramatic protest about something, and Clara said something back with considerable authority, and William said something practical that probably resolved it, and Rosa's voice came through the window warm and firm and affectionate. Warren and Sadie sat on the porch and listened to their house full of life, and the mockingbird in the cedar tree did its magnificent impersonation of every other bird in Texas, and the Bancroft spread was lit by the last of the evening sun in a way that turned the grass to gold, and there was no part of it that was not, in all the ways that mattered most, exactly right. He had not left the ranch in 4 months, and then she had ridden past, and he had saddled up. That was the beginning. And from the beginning, which happened on a May morning in 1882 on a dirt road in the Texas Hill Country, with a man who moved on instinct and a woman who assessed a stranger in 30 seconds and found him worth trusting. Everything else followed. The land, the children, the years of work and laughter and honest argument, and the kind of love that deepens rather than diminishes, that grows more specific and more sure the more it is tested by ordinary life. They had many more evenings on that porch, many more mornings on the road into Coopersville, later with the children piled into the wagon, and the school day beginning with the ring of the bell that still worked. Many more nights talking past midnight about things that mattered and things that did not matter, and sometimes simply sitting in the comfortable silence of two people who had found their way to each other across the wide and various country of grief and distance and hope. The ranch was real and the work was constant, and the Texas weather remained opinionated. And some years were harder than others, and none of them were spent the way those 4 closed months had been spent, in the gray half-presence of a life being maintained rather than lived. Warren Bancroft and Sadie Ramsey Bancroft grew old on the land they had built together, and the children grew up and came back and brought families of their own. And the schoolhouse in Coopersville eventually had 3 rooms, and the South Creek ran through every season faithfully. And on a particular evening every spring when the bluebonnets were up along the fence line, Warren would look east from the porch toward the road where he had stood with fence pliers in his hand in May of 1882. And he would feel the same thing he had felt in the first second of watching her ride past, the absolute rightness of having moved.